These are my four favourite novels of 2016. I want to talk about them as a writer as much as a reader, because I think each one has a quality which I think is beyond my capabilities, which is not something I think often, it has to be said. But each novel just manages to be a supreme example of its formal choice. The first one is Martin John by Anna Kana Schofield. What is particularly brave about this novel, I think, is the amount of white page, the amount of blank spaces in this novel. And it's something I've often wanted to do, and it's often something novelists do, and they actually feel terrified of not filling the page up. And in this novel, there is more blank page, more white space, more nothing than there is writing. But that means that the writing has to count. It has to have the density, richness of expression that a whole page of writing has. And because it isn't poetry, although it has poetic elements, it has to operate like poetry, but in the novel form. I think lots of writers want to achieve that, but in the end, we just conform and fill the page up. It's extraordinary, and just to give you the background, it's actually about a man, an Irishman in London, who has an inner compulsion to sexual public exposure. In the old world, a flasher. And it's a novel is a novel incredibly sensitive to what that compulsion feels like. It is a novel without judgment, but it's also a novel without that isn't in any way sentimental or prying or overtly controversial. I recommend it wholeheartedly. Second novel, Solar Bones by Mike McCormick, which I really love, and it's written in my favourite formal device, if you will, which is the single run-on sentence. I think lots of writers experiment with the run-on sentence. It's a very enjoyable device, and it does ask of us different ways to explore thought. What's extraordinary about this novel is the gentleness of the beats in the voice. The narrator is a very ordinary man with an ordinary family, with an ordinary job, and the great thing about this is that there is essentially the juxtaposition of an ordinary man and an extraordinary form, the run-on sentence. And I think really, if we're going to take subjects that don't have great glamour, great existential difficulty, that isn't wrestling with profundity, the form is a way of creating that in the kind of quotidian, till we start to think that actually when we look at ordinary life, profundity is present. And I think that Mike McCormick succeeds in that better than anyone has in years. It's interesting setting that against Amir McBride's A Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing, which is a novel, an inner narrative, which is incredibly fractured and fragmented, with one-word sentences, two-word sentences, where thought is broken up and twisted and blown apart. Now, my position is that actually A Girl Is a Half-Formed Thing is the greatest expression of inarticulate thought. That when we actually think, we think in these kinds of sentences. It's just when we imagine how we think, we actually turn them into sentences which are actually more like Solar Bones. But actually, I think what happens is they've ended up creating two polarities. One is the deep fracturing of thought, and one is the turning thought into an unending thread. And I think both work extraordinarily, but they are both written in the last few years and both doing very different things to internal thought and worth reading together. Number 3 is Counter Narratives by John Keane, published in the UK by Fitzcarraldo Editions, published in the US by New Directions. This is a book of extraordinary formal rigour. What Keane manages to do is to divest himself from the story, so the emotion is entirely generated by story and character and time and place and history. And that's a very difficult thing to do. To not be present in your writing, but still make the stories deeply human. Because actually, to not be present in what one's writing is to be sort of very high level journalism, a journalism of great integrity. And in a certain way, this is a book that has great integrity, and I think it's partly because he's taken actually sort of journalistic devices and turned them into storytelling. But there isn't a moment where there is a wrong note where you think the writer has crept in. There is just great integrity to these stories. What they are, just so you know, are short form pieces, although they are long short form pieces, which explore slave and black history in the New World. And that's obviously another reason why I couldn't write something like that. But anyway, but they are stories that I think operate in a way that no other short stories I've ever read operate, which is that at first you feel as though they are actually keeping you slightly at a distance, but it's only so they can create that something is created while that distance is there. The bricks are being put in place, so you're suddenly seeing. I can't really explain it. Just read it. Read it. It's just brilliant. Something happens, 2 or 3, 5 pages in, where you feel you're in a world that you felt you might never make sense of. That's, I think, what happens. And fourthly, there is Forbidden Line by Paul Stambridge, published by Galley Beggar. Now, this is by far the most original piece of writing I've read in a long time. It's original. I mean, it's original in its energy, in its zest, in its kind of imaginative force. Um, it does. I've chatted to a few people who've started. It probably takes a little while to get into. It's a long book. It's about 500 odd pages. One needs to be slightly patient with it as it creates its world. Many books need 100 pages for you to kind of fall in love with them, and this is a novel that over the 500 pages I fell in very deeply in love with. But what's interesting is it is highly original, although it is actually a modern retelling of the Don Quixote story. But it's so potty that it is set in present day, but it seems to also have a kind of trans-temporal storyline that includes the peasant revolt. It is slightly bonkers. A friend of mine says it possesses a tradition of English jocacity that can be found in Chaucer, Shakespeare, and there will be others. I can't think of them now. Right the way up to Douglas Adams, even. It's playful. It's slightly crazed, obsessive, but there is just a sort of human. There's a sort of joyfulness in it, which I think is something that literature often fails, where the energy is actually bubbling over. It's uncontainable. Something has happened where the writer, where the characters in the story have almost got not only beyond the writer, they've almost got beyond themselves. And therefore it just becomes a world unto itself. So I absolutely, I've just bought it for all my colleagues at work. So that's how much I feel it deserves a reading. It is just, I probably haven't given you any sense of what it is, but it's also a work of extraordinary erudition. And it's very hard to be erudite and bonkers at the same time and still have something that you feel isn't just a novelty, which I don't think this is. I think this is. I think Harold Bloom said that to be part of the canon, you have to think you're doing something just like other people, but can't help doing something that is original. And I think that's what he's achieved. It adds to the canon, and there is also a swerve. He also creates a swerve. And few novels achieve that. Hope you have a happy holiday period, New Year, etc. If I don't post before the New Year, see you in 2017, which cannot be worse than 2016. Brexit, Syria, Trump. Actually, it could be worse, can't it? Because of Brexit, Syria, and Trump. These things don't go away.